Remember that sound? The scratchy symphony of computers connecting to the internet in the early 2000s? It wasn't noise. It was a portal opening to a new world. A world where anyone with a microphone could be a broadcaster. No gatekeepers, no rules, just the raw power of your voice. Back then, everyone asked, what's a podcast? Now millions of people listen to one every day. What used to be a fun hobby people did in their bedrooms and garages changed how we tell stories. Even the word podcast was foreign at that point. Then it was everywhere. But now the definition is getting fuzzy again.
This question about what is a podcast is so important. It is not a philosophical discussion. This affects dollars that go into people's pockets. This affects jobs.
The rebels who started it all might not even recognize what it's becoming. One of those rebels was probably not someone you'd associate with podcasting.
Robin Williams at Audible.com.
He was playing with on-demand audio when most of us were still using dial-up.
Today, we're here with Bonnie Hunt. Welcome, Bonnie Hunt.
Robin, is it funny to interview somebody you know?
Yeah, it's kind of frightening because you know everything.
In January 2000, Williams recorded chats with his celebrity friends from home. Nobody was calling it a podcast yet, but James Cridlin, who founded the newsletter Pod News, says that's exactly what it was.
I've got some YouTube of him talking to a clearly befuddled Jay Leno about what this whole thing is. And he doesn't have the faintest idea.
So every week it's a different
show made for the web for people to download. And
okay.
And it has this stuff. And you can either load that on your computer, and from there you can load it to an MP3 player, which
MP3.
An MP3.
And at one point, Robin says,
it's basically radio.
But it's on this thing. And he was showing an Audible portable player. And Jay Leno finally goes,
radio, now I understand.
Now you understand, it's radio.
Brilliant. I mean, it's a fascinating watch. I should say this really annoys the podcast OG.
That is, the purists of the form.
Who believe that podcasting started with Dave Weiner and Adam Curry with the RSS feed.
And this isn't just a debate about who started it all, but rather what the medium is really about.
Podcasting's unique selling point has always been that it's something for your ears when your eyes are busy.
But as video and other formats crowd in, we're seeing a big change that could reshape what made podcasting special in the first place. This is the story of the people who changed broadcasting almost by accident. They went around the big networks and built something new. And now we're using the medium itself to answer that original question, what's a podcast? From the producers of Age of Audio, Oxford Road presents a Media Roundtable special series, What's a Podcast? The Revolution Redefined. I'm Allison Marino, founder of Lipstick and Vinyl. I've been in podcasting since 2014. I'll be your guide as we explore where podcasting came from, where it is now, and where it might be heading. This series comes from Conversations at the Media Roundtable, a podcast hosted by Dan Granger. He's the CEO of Oxford Road and Veritone One, the biggest podcast ad agency out there. Dan's been on a mission to connect with the visionaries who built this industry from the ground up. Not just collecting stories, but fighting to define the soul of podcasting.
You might be thinking, why does the definition of a podcast even matter? Well, here's why it matters. If we don't define it clearly, we leave it to others to decide. Largely, tech platforms have a tendency to come in and come out of the space and make it mean what best suits their interests, but that may not be what's best for the broader community. Let's not let algorithms define it for us. Let's take a stand. So I got involved in the spoken word industry for love of the game. I was a production assistant in 2003, had just gotten out of college, and I was working for a documentary company running tapes all around town, and I spent a lot of time in LA traffic. And I got so sick of hearing the same songs on the radio. I just couldn't take it anymore. And one day I hit the AM button and it opened a whole new world to me. I heard long form discussion, unpacking things with perspectives I hadn't heard before, debate, and new ways of using the spoken word in a way that really connected with me deeply.
So when Dan first heard about podcasting a couple years later in 2005, he thought, this is it.
This is the answer, and the revolution that ended up becoming a real renaissance in audio content was just starting to take shape, and I knew I wanted to be a part of it.
My story was similar but different. After years in network radio, I found podcasting in 2014. What hit me right away was how podcasting could maybe solve a problem that radio had, the lack of diverse voices, especially women. In a media world dominated by men, podcasting opened doors for everyone with a story to tell. My journey into podcasting mirrors the medium's own evolution, starting with that moment of discovery and growing into something more significant than anyone expected. Now let's explore how podcasting transformed from a tech experiment in garages and bedrooms into the cultural force it is today. A story of rebels, visionaries, and accidental pioneers who changed how we connect through sound. Act 1, the audio vanguard. Our story starts with two unlikely heroes, Adam Curry, the perfectly coiffed MTV VJ, and Steve Jobs, the guy who made turtlenecks intimidating. Adam Curry was pretty tech-savvy, and he had a vision. He wanted to make broadcasting more democratic, more accessible to people who didn't have jobs introducing music videos.
Hi, Adam Curry back with you on MTV. Well, here's the story.
Steve Jobs was building Apple's empire of sleek, user-friendly technology. iTunes was already changing music. But there was nothing for spoken content. Jobs saw that people would want something to listen to when they weren't in the mood for music.
And it's called podcasting. As you know, the podcasting phenomenon is exploding right now.
The missing piece was RSS, or Real Simple Syndication, an internet feed that automatically delivers new content to listeners. Think of it like a newspaper delivery truck that knows exactly what you want and brings it the moment it's ready. No subscription fees, no waiting. The open system defined what made podcasting special. It wasn't just about audio, it was about freedom. Content you could listen to anywhere, anytime, without anyone telling you what you could or couldn't hear.
Today, algorithms are starting to remove that freedom as technology decides who gets heard and seen and what content gets prioritized. Now, if podcasting loses its openness, we lose that democratization that is the promise of podcasting.
Dave Weiner, a software developer and blogger, had created RSS to share blog posts. But when he teamed up with Adam Curry, they turned it into the backbone of podcasting, sending audio files around the internet automatically for the first time ever. Here is Dave Weiner.
People think that it was some great technical accomplishment. It wasn't. We already had all the pieces. We had RSS, which was the format for syndication.
Weiner shared Adam Curry's excitement at the thought of bypassing content gatekeepers. Paul Riesemandale, president at Signal Hill Insights, jumped in early following Weiner's work.
I was actually a reader of Dave's blog back then. So when he first outlined the idea and made it practicable, I was very excited. To me, I immediately saw it as, well, it's radio on demand, right? Which is kind of the way I was thinking about it at the time. This is before podcasting, the word existed, so we didn't have a word to call it by. And I started actually just messing around with it on my own, hand coding my own RSS feed.
This mix of personality, tech, and rebellion created the perfect conditions for a revolution. And again, the revolutionaries themselves weren't even aware they had just started one. It was like inventing a new kind of telephone without knowing people would one day use it to listen to strangers talk about murder mysteries during the daily commute.
Adam Curry is one of the guys that invented podcasting. And he has a podcast called The Daily Source.
I've actually had to restart the show 3 times. My Mac has been acting up like a mother.
Okay.
Dan actually learned about podcasting, not from Steve Jobs' announcement, but from another early adopter.
I learned about podcasting from Leo Laporte, who had started his show just following Adam Curry and his launch into podcasting using the RSS. Leo was the weekend host on the local radio station where I was a very green seller, and he and I were stuck in LA traffic going to visit a car dealership to try to sell local ads on the weekend in Leo's tech show. And he started explaining where media was moving, and it really opened my eyes to what was coming around the corner as the internet converged with radio.
And how freeing it was going to be for audio creators.
one of the things that I did, even in the earliest days of KFI, is I recorded the show and I'd put it on a website hour by hour so people could listen to it after the fact on the website. All it takes to turn it into a podcast is to make an RSS feed so that people can use an RSS reader, later podcast clients, to subscribe. And that's what podcast clients do to this day.
It used to be, there was a program director somewhere that told you that it was okay for you to talk on the radio and be heard. I didn't have to get a program director's permission to do this, which is something that, I think is like the essence and the spirit of what made this whole thing so spectacular and allowed voices and ideas and a renaissance of content and programming that just never really existed before.
But as with punk rock, micro-brewed beer, and indie movies, a battle soon emerged between the revolutionaries and another group of people who wanted to move podcasting from the bedroom into the boardroom. Act 2, The Wild West. Before podcasting could become an industry, it had to be an experiment. And like any good experiment, it needed people willing to break things. The early days were chaotic. Few rules, tons of opportunity, and plenty of trial and error. When he first tried podcasting, James Cridland was working at a London radio station in the early 2000s.
We were a music radio station on AM. I spotted podcasting appearing, and I worked out a way of essentially producing a version of our breakfast show.
But when he shared his ideas with early podcasters, they weren't exactly welcoming.
And I then ended up speaking at the first podcast conference in London in 2005, where I was shouted at for being from big media and not understanding what podcasting was for. It wasn't for the likes of you.
Coming from radio myself, I got both sides of this fight. The traditional media folks wanted to bring production value. The indies fought to keep podcasting scrappy, freewheeling, and homemade. Dan Granger remembers a similar contrast playing out back when he worked in terrestrial radio.
I worked for what at the time was the largest talk radio station, KFI AM 640, more stimulating talk radio. We had one of the hosts came in to talk to the sales team. His name was John Cobelt of the John and Ken Show. And he shared an anecdote with us from the early days of his show where he and his partner Ken would do a new topic every hour in a 3-hour show every day of the year. So they'd cover about 1,000 different topics. What they figured out was, based on the market dynamics in a limited geography with the constraints of terrestrial radio, the fewer topics they covered, the more ratings they got. So they ended up narrowing down to like 3 subjects that they would hit on every single day. And I actually thought that was a tragedy, because the canvas of the spoken word and the ability to explore so many different things was being bottlenecked by this kind of forced market dynamic that you could only listen to content on a few different stations, and they all had to compete with each other. So all they could do is kind of play the hits, so to speak, on talk radio.
Whereas with podcasting, there were no hits. It was more like the early days of public broadcasting, where people at NPR and member stations were kind of making it up as they went along. And public radio would later play a huge role in podcasting's growth. Ira Glass from This American Life recalls how they started with podcasting.
There weren't that many good podcasts out there at that time. People were podcasting, but now there's so many podcasts. It's so hard to get anybody to notice you. But we were like one of the NPR shows at the beginning in that era of podcasting were putting out stuff that was like kind of fun to listen to, wait, don't tell me and all that, fresh air, like these really great interviews. And so it was just very early content that was at a level of listenability that was produced. And those shows for a period were always in the top 10, the top 10, the top 5 podcasts were always like NPR shows, public radio shows.
For Glass and public radio producers, they didn't have to change their content for podcasting. Their radio skills transferred perfectly.
Before podcasting, This American Life was a radio show on public radio. And so there's over 500 public radio stations. We had a huge audience from that. And And, we were a weekly hour-long show. And really, like, the things that made This American Life a good podcast made it a good radio show. It's just all the same. You know what I mean? Like, there's just, we're just telling very traditional kinds of stories where you hear the beginning and you want to find out what's going to happen, and you get caught up in the people and your feelings get caught up. And it's just like, it's very old school narrative storytelling and out for fun.
Dennis Berman, president of the Free Press, also sees a lot of similarities between the two media, but he draws the comparisons even farther back.
In 1920s, there was this new technology, and no one knew what it was to become. There were people who were creating radio stations who were just hobbyists. There was no FCC. There was no control over actual frequencies.
Early radio and early podcasting followed similar paths. Both started as passion projects. Both were chaotic before getting organized. Both changed communication forever. History might not repeat itself exactly, but it sure follows familiar patterns. But what happens when rebels become the establishment? As podcasting grew, it caught the eye of entrepreneurs, advertisers, and media execs who saw it as more than just a medium for storytelling. They saw it as a potential moneymaker. The Wild West was about to be incorporated. Act 3. The Gold Rush. The commodification of podcasting started with familiar names. Adam Carolla, a huge radio star in Los Angeles, lost his radio contract. But instead of finding another station, he teamed up with radio exec Norm Pattis to launch the Adam Carolla podcast in 2009. He brought his loyal fans with him into this new world.
It's the Adam Carolla Show.
Yeah, get it on. Got to get it on. No choice but to get it on. Mandate. Get it on. And welcome to the show.
Here's Adam Carolla.
When the radio ended for me in 2009, I was aware that a lot of people listened to my morning terrestrial radio on the computer. And I was never tech savvy. What I didn't know is many of those people went to their computers and went to the station's website or whatever and streamed the show. Or essentially, it was essentially podcasting before podcasting. At some point, they'd go, and you had 16 million minutes of streaming last month. I was like, look, if there's going to be that many people listening to that many minutes, certainly there's got to be a business, some business model for that. So I left on a Friday and started podcasting the following Monday.
For Dan Granger, Carolla's entry was a pivotal moment that signaled podcasting's business potential.
I was scared to leave my job at Clear Channel. I had a very successful book of business representing advertisers and a lot of Silicon Valley direct-to-consumer brands. Adam Carolla had just started his podcast, and that was a signal that things were getting serious in this space. I had watched it with a lot of hobbyists, but there was not enough reach and not enough traction to really build a business around it.
Dan was so convinced of podcasting's potential that he went to extraordinary lengths to connect with Carolla.
On the local terrestrial station that I was involved with, we had another station, a sports station here in LA with the Petros and Money Show. Adam Carolla was on it just trying to promote his podcast and find audience. And I knew he was like 10 footsteps away from me in the studio and that he would wrap up about 7:00 when the show ended. So I waited at my desk until he walked out of the studio, and I stalked him as he walked down the hall, and I said, "Hey, Adam, I work with a lot of brands. I put them on the radio. We put together endorsement deals." I said, "I'd love to see if we could put some of them in your podcast."
What made Carolla stand out wasn't just his name. It was his radio experience. He could easily fill hours of talk time every day. New podcasters couldn't match that. His audience grew fast, and the money followed right behind.
The results were otherworldly. It dwarfed anything that we were able to achieve on a impression by impression basis through talk radio.
Carolla and his cohort hadn't just found creative freedom for themselves. They'd hit upon a whole new business model for what they did. They cut out the middlemen, made ads personal, and built real connections with listeners. Like a friend telling you about the products they love, if that friend happened to read ad scripts for mattresses and meal kits in the middle of their stories.
Because one of the key differences with podcasting from everything that we had seen before was the direct-to-consumer nature of the medium. And so if you wanted to create a podcast, suddenly you could self-select and say, here I am, world, and find your people, find your community anywhere in the world around something that you thought was interesting. It was such perfect timing because these direct-to-consumer brands were looking for the same type of audience who were willing to say, we're going to go around brick and mortar.
The new podcast industry faced a big challenge right away, convincing skeptical advertisers to spend money on this unproven medium. Norm Pattis, who started Podcast One in 2012, took it upon himself to slay this particular dragon.
All the research that's been done indicates that the bulk of the podcast audience is very different than the radio audience. They're not the same audiences.
Instead of just claiming podcasts worked, Pattis hired Edison Research to study both the medium's impact and how well podcast ads performed. This data gave media buyers at big agencies the confidence to spend their clients' money on podcasting. Dan Granger.
Edison's early research really helped jumpstart the industry and legitimize it, and they continue to do work like their Infinite Dial report that helps us make sense of how the medium continues to evolve. In addition to the expert interviews we've conducted for this podcast, we also worked with Edison to survey consumers and find out, what does the general population believe that a podcast is? So we could land on a central definition and give the industry a more clear way to move forward that balances the best of what podcasting was in the past and what is necessary for it to continue to grow and evolve in the future.
The focus on research helped legitimize what had been mostly experimental. It showed that podcasting wasn't just creative, it delivered real results for brands. With no gatekeepers, no FCC rules, and growing audiences, podcasting became irresistible to brands looking for new ways to reach people, and they paid well for it. I was working in podcast advertising during this time. I saw firsthand how the medium grew from experimental to essential. By 2014, brands were starting to understand the power of host reads. AJ Feliciano is general manager of the Roost Podcast Network.
Podcasting was built on the promise that this medium was going to be good for direct response advertisers, because what you're getting is a custom host-read endorsement that will convert for your product or service.
I think that what made podcasting so special was it spoke to people's completionist tendencies, the same way that binge watching series on streaming services does.
Lex Friedman is former chief revenue officer at Midroll and was my boss there, and later head of podcast partnerships at Amazon.
You didn't skip to the next show because an ad came on. You were listening to that show. And yes, we all know that there are increasingly in every podcast app, there's some button to try to skip through the ads. But especially when it's a host read ad, especially when it's a host who can instill their personality into that ad read, it's worth listening to. It's obviously advertising versus editorial, but it's still content. It's still fun to listen to, especially if the host is having a fun time doing that ad read.
Dan Granger.
Dollar Shave Club, Blue Apron, MeUndies, ZipRecruiter. These were the companies that fueled the revolution. The fission that occurred when direct-to-consumer brands met direct-to-consumer media in new ways really unlocked amazing scale, and podcasting fueled that for them. And meanwhile, they were the brands that were willing to take the risks and not have to be stuck in traditional media.
Nick Giorgio of Simply Safe, one of the first brands to go big on podcast ads, saw them as a perfect opportunity.
We knew the power of an endorsement. Podcast was this new channel with endless scale. Anyone can start a podcast on like a radio frequency or a TV network. Some podcasters drew huge audience really quickly, and we were able to capture those audiences.
By 2014, podcasting had proven itself as a viable medium with a unique business model. The indie spirit was still there, but the industry was ready for something bigger, a breakthrough that would push into the mainstream. That moment was just around the corner. Act 4, The Serial Effect. Then came October 3rd, 2014, and a podcast that changed everything.
Last fall's debut of Serial, which explored the 1999 murder of a Baltimore teen, catapulted podcasts into the mainstream.
It was podcasting's big bang moment, creating a whole universe of possibilities. From that point on, there was podcasting before Serial and podcasting after Serial.
The success of Serial is astonishing. A weekly podcast, a very modern and traditional way of telling stories.
I was driving when I first heard Serial. I remember thinking, this is what a podcast can be. This is amazing storytelling. It wasn't just a big moment for me. It changed everything for the industry.
My next guest is the host of the wildly popular Serial podcast. Please welcome Sarah Koenig.
Serial wasn't just a podcast. It was a cultural phenomenon. Hosted by Sarah Koenig and produced by This American Life, it dug into a murder case with brilliant journalism and storytelling. Within weeks, it went from public radio experiment to mainstream obsession. 5 million downloads, Saturday Night Live parodies. Suddenly, people who'd never heard the word podcast were debating Adnan Syed's case over dinner.
I was up until 4 last night listening to this new podcast called Serial.
Download Serial. It is legit.
When we launched Serial, we actually, our early advertising had to explain to people what a podcast was.
Again, This American Life's Ira Glass.
Like, how do you even listen to this? And then Serial unexpectedly was so insanely popular. This is 10 years ago. So I think there might be people listening to us who don't remember this, but it was a true crime story that Sarah Koenig put together before anybody was making true crime stories in this format. And the thing about Serial that was new at the time was we didn't know if we could make a true story that would last more than one episode. Now that's so taken as like, oh, that's just a normal thing to do. We literally didn't know what do we do to make it so that people listen from one episode to the next. And so Julie Snyder, her producer, and Sarah designed it so it was structured more like a television show than like a traditional radio story. And so there's all these things in the way it's built that kind of pull you forward to the next episode and the next episode and the next episode. We actually talked about, could this be on the radio at the time? And our judgment was that it actually wouldn't work as a radio show because you really needed to hear all of the previous episodes for it to make sense. And people watch TV that way. Well, they'll watch the same show each week at the same time, but people do not generally listen to the radio that way. And so it seemed problematic to put it on the radio in America. And so we felt like the only way that show could exist was as a podcast.
That said, Serial's success wasn't just luck. It had a secret weapon, radio. When Serial launched, the first episode aired on This American Life, which was made by some of the same people and which airs on public radio affiliates nationwide. And at the time, This American Life was a top 3 podcast itself on Apple Podcasts. So Serial got what you would call the This American Life bump. In other words, while anyone could make a podcast, having a platform still mattered. And indie creators without that advantage had to find different ways to break through. This was so exciting to those of us in the industry back then. It was the first time people were talking about a podcast who didn't actually make one. Now we weren't boring people at parties explaining what an RSS feed was. Instead, everyone was debating whether Adnan did it. Hernan Lopez, founder of Wondery, says no one was able to replicate the same success.
And it was a function of being the first one and being so great and having a whole year when there was really nothing really comparable.
The industry felt the impact immediately. Lex Friedman of Midroll recalls how Serial changed his sales conversations.
So for years, every sales conversation had to launch with, what's a podcast? A couple years into it, we had to switch to, people had heard of Serial. And so we could talk about, did they think Adnan Syed was guilty or not? And then a few years after that, they all had their favorite podcasts.
The impact wasn't just cultural, it was financial. Serial showed there was serious money to be made in podcasting. Within a year, traditional media companies were rushing in. Serial's success brought in investment from everywhere. Networks formed essentially overnight. Production quality went way up. And advertisers, who'd been cautiously testing podcast waters, dove in head first. What Serial sparked was nothing short of a creative explosion. a business and cultural phenomenon that would transform not just podcasting, but all of media. And like any major shift in media, this was just the beginning. Dan Granger saw this transformation in his daily business meetings. The entire conversation around podcasting changed almost overnight.
By 2014, when Serial became all the rage, that was the watershed moment when we went from having to explain to everybody we knew what a podcast was to everybody saying, oh, have you heard about this new podcast? This thing is amazing. That was the key moment when the industry really became an industry. But here we are more than a decade post, kind of the watershed moment that was Serial. And the definition is definitely changing.
In our next episode, we'll dive into what happened after Serial sparked the gold rush and how a global pandemic accelerated the rocket rise before bringing the whole industry back down to earth. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road and Veritone One, where we want you to succeed in audio and creator-based media to use influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, to build bridges across differences and preserve fair-minded discussion around the most important topics of our age. If you're a marketer looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to Oxford Road by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to their weekly newsletter, The Influencer. The Media Roundtable would love to hear from you. If you have any feedback or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@mediaroundtable.com. Thank you to our guests and to Haley Weiss, Ruby Mora, Bianca Gorodinsky, Ezra Fox, Mary Jane Balash, Neil Lucy, Olivia Gerving, and the team at Podcast One. This podcast was produced and edited by Sean Michael Colon, the director of the documentary Age of Audio, with additional story editing by Sean Cole and additional editing by Emily Oliver. Music by Breakmaster Cylinder. As always, influence responsibly.